Hi, everyone. So excited to be here again today, especially with my good friend and colleague, Charles Caldwell, who is a excellent executive and leadership coach. We were just talking prior to going live on some opportunities that Charles is more and more involved in. So if you do have an interest in coaching, uh, please reach out to Charles, at least check out his profile. With that said, we're probably maybe expecting Dave Snell, but in the meantime, today's word of the day is compassion. And I know Charles utilizes compassion in all aspects of his everyday life. So, Charles, welcome back. And would love to hear first thoughts on compassion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Don. It's great to be back here again. It's part of my Thursday night ritual now to be here. And this is a great word, compassion. I think that in the last several years, as we emerged out of the pandemic, that there were a lot of well-being issues. There's a lot of stress around the world with all the events that are happening around the world, polarization in political environments. We've got the war in Europe. We've got the war in the Middle East. We've got a lot of violence happening all over the place in Asia and Sudan. And that's, plus the economic uncertainty, it's really creates stress for people. And this is a time when managers and leaders really need to bring compassion and bring empathy to their world and their management style. That's a big, big thing right now. And managers or leaders who are not doing that, and even colleagues and friends, as an HR professional and as a coach, if someone finds themselves really in a place of distress, often the first question I'll ask myself is, are they well? Is there something that's happened to them that's caused them to have a spike in some sort of emotional or mental well-being capacity? And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. It doesn't, maybe not need counseling. It's always a possibility. But the incidence of well-being right now, and all the surveys spell this out, the incidence of well-being is very, very high. And the world needs compassion and empathy.
Yeah, and it's so true. And if it will only continue to grow as far as value as things continue to move forward, especially with AI, especially with all the social media influence, especially with all the geopolitical and economic situations. Everybody is not very certain of tomorrow. I can say that, whether that's a good outlook or not so good. And I believe working collectively, looking out for each other, and you can break down the barriers of authority or of leadership by community, by reaching out and being people to people. I think that's the first element that somebody needs to really take into consideration is who are you working with? How are they working today? What could you do to help them in their situation, complement what they're doing, and be a resource for situations where people can be proactive, right? Who can reach out and share in advance. This is just what happened to me. Here's what I'm going through, and I think that can only really take place when there's trust. When someone feels free to share without recrimination. And I think that makes a big difference because it allows somebody to avoid some overreaction to a situation that makes real sense for the context of which that person's working with. Again, trust, communication, having an open ear, maybe not assuming or not judging too quickly, and being able just to share suspicions in a good way. It looks to me like, this or that, and someone will come back and say, not a problem, not an issue, or I guess I'm not a very good poker player. I start to wear my heart on my sleeve or something. Yeah, I think that's really key. And I think the managers who could really take advantage of it You know, that old saying, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care, really is more and more relevant all the time. And caring people are usually sharing people. So thoughts, Charles?
Absolutely, I agree with you. And I want to add another word into the way you've described compassion, and that is commitment. The compassion is not necessarily always, it's often, but but it doesn't always have to be an emotional feeling. It's not necessarily about emotions. You know, true compassion is really about a commitment to another person's life. And out of uh, the efforts that an individual takes to support another person that might be going through a difficult time, they're in a context, they're in a situation where they need compassion. That's commitment, taking a stand for them. And there's not necessarily any emotion involved in that. In fact, it's helpful maybe if there's less emotion, because people can get very emotionally attached to the circumstances that they may need compassion and empathy. So it's really about taking a stand for people. And one of the words, one of the expressions that I've used in the HR world when you are meeting people in these types of situations where they do need compassion or empathy is not locking horns with them, but working alongside them. So if you get into situations where there's conflict in the workplace, you work alongside people to resolve that conflict as opposed to locking horns with them. And that's all about being with them. It's not about pitying them. It's not about fixing someone. It's about being with them and being with them in a way that allows them to see how in their particular circumstances, whatever it is that's causing the need for some compassion and for some empathy, that they do have control of certain elements of that, starting with their reaction. And when you take a stand for someone without not necessarily the emotional reaction, compassion, there's a lot of empaths out there who don't get emotionally attached, but you wouldn't know that when you talk to them because they're so good at understanding where people are at and appreciating where people are coming from and what they're going through, but they're not necessarily emotionally attached.
Yeah, those are excellent points. And what struck me was one's positioning. You know, just because you may be the boss or the leader or whatever you call yourself doesn't mean you always have to be in front, right? To your point, you could be side by side, and a lot of times you can follow. You know, there's no reason not to. And, everybody wants a turn at bat, and when you're confident and comfortable in your situation, you're more inclined to give somebody, get in front of me, take care of this, or I trust you, I believe in you. It doesn't have to be absolute where I'm the boss and you're the employee, and one day you'll be the boss and somebody else will be your employee. It's like, how do you build team? Well, it looks like we've got Dean LeBay here. Nice to see you, Dean.
Hi, Dean.
I just saw you were at the Louisiana Restaurant Association. So congratulations. Dean has been an inspiration to me, and in a way, we've been an inspiration to Dean over time. And I think, that's where compassion really shows, is over time. Anybody can say a nice word, pick up a feeling, and work with it, but where are they over time? And I think if you're looking at the future and you're looking longer term, you're looking to build foundations to strong, compassionate relationships where, someone may not be able to help you, but they're more than happy to hear you. And just being heard makes you feel a little bit more comfortable. And there's always nice to have an ace in the hole that, if I need something, there's a person willing to listen, and maybe they can help, but listening is important. Being alone is a tough position, especially in chaotic times and situations. If there's anybody else listening, I'm sure there is because I look at the numbers, feel free to share your thoughts on compassion as well as where you're from, any comments. Last week, we had two unbelievable individuals in the audience who came up with some really cool thoughts and ideas that we're able to bounce around and hopefully bring everybody into the conversation instead of being primarily the conversation. And Charles has a couple comments here. Compassion is a stand, not just a feeling. True compassion isn't just an emotional reaction, but a commitment to the possibility of another person's life. So true. when I see the opportunities for people who can take advantage of things. Can you hear me, Charles? I can't hear you.
You can't hear now. Now can you? Oh dear, no.
Yeah, I
Okay,
can.
so that means you went offline and I was on talking on mute. Oh dear, that's a disaster. Well, I can just repeat what I said.
Well, that was only 2/3 of the Three Monkeys.
Well, that happened the other day with on another podcast I was on after um, the after a certain video intro and a bit of a promotion. The other podcaster was on mute and I was off studio. I was in the background in the back studio, and she just kept talking, not realizing she was on mute. And I was sending her messages, "You're on mute. You're on mute." Oh, okay, well, I can repeat what I said before if you like.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, and in a nutshell, what I was saying, and I'm sure people know this because they were reading my lips, but compassion requires clearing our, kind of getting rid of our narrative about people. And when we're working alongside people in situations where they need compassion, we really need to suspend our judgments and suspend our interpretations about them. And it was describing, for example, circumstances, especially where there's been uh, difficult relationship breakups, acrimonious relationship breakups. There's his side, there's her side of the story. There, who knows what circumstances took place that resulted in the breakup, but one of those two individuals might come to you needing some support. And when they need support, it's not that they're broken or that they may or may not need help in some situations, but it's really about relating to them without assumptions, without any judgments about the situation that they're in, but really relating to them as a whole, as someone who needs some compassion and empathy in that particular time.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dean comes back with, I'm still using Charles planting tree story. And Dean agreed that there was a mute.
Yes. Sorry about that, Dean.
Well, Dean stuck with us, and I think that was interesting as from a compassionate gesture. So a lot of times we appreciate compassion from the audience in our own foibles and challenges and trials and tribulations. And I think what comes around goes around. So the person who's compassionate can hopefully be in store for some compassion themselves and really work the relationship in a higher plane where compassion is an active ingredient in the listening process as well as the returning process. Being present when someoe's talking and picking up more than their words. What is their expressions? How are they, are they uplifted? Are they high energy? That will also tell you a few things. And it may be able to help you adjust to situations without having to go into a long investigation. And a lot of people, you got to know who you're dealing with, don't want to be put on the spot. And a lot of people are proud and don't want to admit they're having issues. And some people want to keep things very personal. All that is very understandable, but one has to have some relevant context in which to be able to communicate and feel good at the end of the communication or interaction that something was accomplished. It might have been a direct benefit, like, hey, here's how we're going to do something, let's go to work. And it could be, okay, in the future, here's how we're going to have to support each other. Or it gives you an opportunity to say, here's what I really like. Here's what I enjoy. And here's how I like it. And, whatever that situation is, it makes everybody looking for an opportunity to bring that person up. So when you can be more we-oriented than me-oriented and think of the other person first, and if you can get one winner out of a conversation, that's far superior to no winners. Or what's even worse is leaving a conversation feeling worse for having it and maybe losing trust in that person. And I think that's also key, is when someone does confide in you, you need to have a level of confidentiality, and you need to have, an opportunity to separate certain things from certain things. And that's a teaching, learning process. And I think that's why people who know each other well and teams who work for a longer period of time, they get it. They just have that energy and that chemistry that has been proven over time. So it's new people that you're dealing with a brand new list of opportunities. Now that you're expanding your coaching and, initiative, how does compassion fit into that?
Well, one question I have before we jump into that is, I would like Dean just to remind me about which planting the tree story I was using, because I actually have 2 planting the tree stories. So Dean, if you can drop that into the comments, I can remember which story that is and maybe echo it back again and see where we're at since I last shared that. But I think that to answer your question, Dawn, about what is bringing compassion all about in executive coaching, one of them is compassion is about responsibility. It's not about rescuing. And also coaching is not about mentoring. It's not about training. In mentoring, often mentoring and coaching are very, very similar. So when you're mentoring, you might also be coaching. You might be mentoring in a style of coaching, but coaching is really about asking questions, asking good questions, asking the right questions, asking difficult questions that will create answers for people that they did not see beforehand. Mentoring is a combination of asking questions and also imparting information. Now, when you're coaching, if people are in a situation where they need compassion, you have to make sure that, and this doesn't just apply to coaching, but I'm using this as an example to answer your question, that you're not helping people, you're not imparting information, you're asking questions, and you're asking authentic questions. Because if you're helping people, that can often disempower people and reinforces any victimhood that they have, or any narrative they have about why they're stuck in their particular situation. So it's really about holding people accountable. I don't mean that in a negative way, because often when we hear the words responsible and accountable, we people often have a loss of power around the word responsibility, or they think accountability means you're going to be a tough leader or a tough individual. But it's really about empowering people to have agency over their own situation and over their own growth. And when I'm a coach and I'm working with people, I really have a lot of compassion. No matter how they're feeling, I have a lot of compassion and empathy for the potential that's within them. So all the challenges that they're up against are the circumstances that they're up against in their life. I see the potential in them regardless of those circumstances and regardless of those challenges. And I take a stand that we're going to get through all those challenges. I'm compassionate about how they might be reacting to those situations, but I don't help them necessarily. I empower them to have their own agency over what can they control, what can they alter in the situation.
Yeah, excellent approach, because, the client that you're serving, is depending on you to get them to a place they may not have been able to get to without you. And so it's really not what the coach can do, but what the coach can help the individual do. And I think that's very primary, because a lot of times, based on ego or whatever, there's a competition, or a person has to assert their position or authority, and feels like once they give in, or once they're looking a little bit too compassionate, they're losing some of their, let's say, hold on that person. And I think that's an issue the coach or the trainer has to focus on more, is, to your point, Charles, being able to take inventory, qualifying people, and make certain assumptions, and then test them with some level of questioning, and give them some context to the context. Right? Here's why I would like to ask these questions, because you don't want to have mysteries create more mysteries, and all of a sudden you have more distance and separation, and really understanding what the goal is, not just what the order of business is. So some people may be financially driven. Some people are influence driven. Some people just want to impart what they have or what they've developed over time and share it. So really, how do you want to leverage the relationship to make it as positive for the client? Because if it is, it'll be more positive for you. Because at the end of the day, people are going to look for metrics or results that says, okay, here's where we started, here's what we've been able to do, and here's what it has resulted in. And people will be more inclined to build relationships and go longer term if they can find something that's tangible and measurable, versus, hey, it's great talking with you and we have a lot of fun and we come up with some great ideas, but it just starts over again the next time we talk. And you can only be responsible for so much, and at a certain point, I always took a two-step approach to everything. I take a step, you take a step, you take a step, I take a step, but nobody has to take two steps, right? And you can't, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And really, what's the comfort level? Are you satisfied? Are you happy? I mean, you could get great results and find a relationship to be tenuous, or, it was great until it wasn't, and you don't have a direction where to go. So Dean, if you're still watching, we'd be happy to hear about the tree story to refresh Charles's memory.
Yeah, I have two tree stories, and it'd be great to know which one he's referring to, because one of those tree stories actually came up this week, which was somewhat interesting. But I think coming back to what you're saying, and if Dean comes around and answers that question, which tree story, I can come back and share the tree story that came up this week. I also want to emphasize that there's a distinction between sympathy and compassion. Sympathy is really about feeling for someone, but the risk with sympathy is it can keep them stuck in their suffering. Now, obviously, when people are going through a bereavement, when they're experiencing grief, we want to have sympathy for them in those situations. But in a situation, for example, executive coaching or leadership coaching or life coaching. Person, you want to be careful about too much sympathy in those situations, because the sympathy can keep them stuck in their suffering. Whereas compassion, like I somewhat described earlier, working alongside someone, is really about being with someone without any emotional attachment to their circumstances or the pain they might be experiencing. And that allows for transformation. So compassion is not about feeling sorry for someone. And I'm not saying that sympathy is feeling sorry for someone, but obviously in extreme situations when people are going through bereavement and are experiencing grief due to the loss of a loved one or a close friend or anybody, in those situations, yes, we bring sympathy to the situation. But in general, compassion is not about, and we might feel sorry for them, but in general, compassion is not about feeling sorry for someone. It's about giving them back to themselves, and reflecting back, being a mirror. This is what communication skills are going to teach people. It's not about carrying their burden, but it's about seeing them as already whole, as I was describing earlier, as a coach, seeing the potential in people, seeing that they're already capable, that they can overcome their circumstances and overcome whatever is pushing them to a place where they need compassion, and standing for them and what they can achieve, for the potential that you see or a coach sees that they can achieve in themselves.
Well, I think, one thing, a distinction I just heard, is the important part is not feeling sorry, not feeling something else. It's just feeling and really relating. Again, it's not like, oh, I know where you're at. And that's a little bit too much. When it's just putting it in the proper context, especially if it's a professional business relationship, there are boundaries and lines you need to respect so you don't cross that line. And then a lot of times you'll inhibit somebody if you get too deep into something, and it has to be a mutual voluntary interest. It can't be, I want to know more about something that you just did or said, and they don't see a need or an interest in sharing it. And they are in charge of themselves, at least, and have at least the 50% ownership in the relationship you're developing. And eventually, how sensitive somebody is, how fragile somebody is, how defensive somebody is. If it's always justifying and defending, there's not a lot of room for growth. If someone's stuck in their ways or just feels no matter what, they have the absolute understanding of something, it puts you at a difficult situation. And that's why up front, it's better to qualify. It's better to share. It's better to put the time in early and not have to find out something later on, because ultimately no one really likes surprises, good or bad. And nobody likes to be sold a bill of goods and find out it wasn't there to begin with. Or a lot of people wing it. They just go with the flow, and they try to counter somebody or compliment somebody. And ultimately, not a lot of good information is being provided, and that limits the person who's working with you. If someone can't tell you what's going on, that's a red flag as to why are we doing this? And also setting the parameters to say, what would it take for you to consider this a big success? A positive initiative that you're taking. And if somebody's totally unreasonable, that I want to change everything in 2 weeks with a couple conversations, well, I think someone needs to review that and or be able to say, I can't do it, which is not always easy. It might be reasonable for somebody else, but here's where I'm at, and here's why. And again, it's about sharing the context, the foundation, the background. I used to do it this way, and then I found this, and here's what's changed. So, I think it's the person you got to know first, who then may become a client or a partner or somebody involved with you down the road. And it's, again, you're not helping somebody by not sharing an honest approach and doing it with integrity. And I think there's a fine line too, where you hit the guardrails when someone says, well, I'm into this and I'm into this. And you say, well, I don't want to be a party to any of that, if that's the case, and they're doing you a favor. You can't force or just believe something enough that it's going to happen. It actually takes locking arms together, walking down the road. And the other element of compassion is having a little fun. It doesn't have to be dire, doesn't have to be the end of the world. It just has to be, okay, well, you kind of slipped a little, whatever. Here's how we get back on the horse and ride again. I think that's important because people want you to help them help themselves. You don't want to build dependency either. I've got all the answers. Whenever you're in trouble, let me know. Because at the end of the day, when you leave, they're there by themselves with the answer. It's that catch a fish, teach a fish type of approach.
Yeah, that's the agency, right? That's having them have agency in the situation, which is the accountability and the responsibility, which is empowered accountability and empowered responsibility, not responsibility the way it would show up in a bureaucracy, who's to blame for this mistake that's happened in the workplace, for example. And I love what you've said, Don, about people taking steps forward. Like you take a step forward, the other person takes a step forward. Sometimes it's two, sometimes it's just 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. And I think that this is a good example of feeding the narrative. If an individual is not careful, as a coach, I always want people to be moving forward. And if people come in and they are in a situation where they really need to be heard, they need to have someone really understand and appreciate something that they're going through, that's fine. But at the same time, my expectation is that they will take steps forward, even if it's simple steps forward, but they will make some forward progress with that situation. Even if it's something very, very, excuse me, very, very simple. It can be a very, very, very simple, small, subtle gesture that they're doing over the next week, but it's still a step forward to have them move forward. And the not moving forward, if a coach entertains someone not moving forward, then eventually that coach is feeding a story that keeps that individual stuck, which doesn't do service to the agency that you're talking about of, helping people help themselves, teaching them to fish so they can fish. I love the quote, at the end of the day, the people looked back and they said, we did it ourselves, the definition of what a natural leader is. And we have lost Don. He's disappeared. Let me keep going. So, and some other things I want to say about moving forward is that action is not just about insight. And sometimes we go through life and we have lots and lots of insights, but we don't turn them into action. And if you want to move forward, whether in personal growth or relationships or leadership, you want to make sure that you're constantly moving forward and always taking action. One of the best ways that you can do that is to make sure that you have got specific written goals. And even if a person is in a situation where they're suffering from some circumstances, it's a good idea for them to write things down and start to establish some goals at some point to move on and to move forward. Now, in really severe cases, when someone is suffering from grieving from a bereavement, for example, might take some time before they can write things down. And last thing you'd want to be doing is saying, "Oh, I think you should set some goals now that this loss has happened." In time, they can do that. But one of the ways that professional counselors will help steer people out of those types of very dark circumstances is through journaling. And the process of journaling also often leads to specific written goals. Don, you're back. You might be having some connectivity issues today.
Oh, absolutely. And
well, fortunately, I was not on mute. The first thing I checked when I saw your picture go, I checked to make sure I was not on mute.
Well, it shows we're making progress even during some difficult times.
Absolutely. One step forward and 2 steps backwards.
You bet. And the main thing is if you can laugh at it and sincerely feel good about it, knowing that, all you can do is all you can do, right? And a lot of times you're a victim of circumstances or situations, or a beneficiary, depending on what it is. The thing that comes to mind with compassion is some things take more than a conversation. Just because someone says, here's my issue, and you say, here's your solution, it doesn't always work that way. It may be, this is going to take, we'll have to take a road down this direction and work on this, or understand it's going to have an impact on what our main goal is, right? And what you might find is a new goal or new opportunity may have been more important than the initial one, because that's what was first in line or first in sight. And until someone opens up the lid and sees what's inside of whatever it is they opened, can they determine what they need to do? So a lot of times it's a review and a revamp, right? Okay, we did this and we understood this, learned this, changed this. Now we want to make another adjustment. So it's always trying to stay down the straight and narrow whenever possible, and knowing that the person is cooperating in a positive way. You don't want to, you never saw a horse never saw a jockey carry the horse over a finish line, right? And it's the same thing with people. You want them to be independent of you, stronger because of you, and because of that, find bigger and better opportunities to work on, as opposed to keep going back to the well and focusing on the initial situation, and being able one day to say, did you realize that now this has appeared? Or all of our work that we could have never anticipated would result in this has. And what does that do now going forward? So it's that progressive nature of, incremental improvement over time scales really well. Doing little things right and correcting situations before they get out of hand is a good primer for future relationships. And pretty soon, once you build that trust, that confidence, and that belief with that individual, it's like, okay, how much more time do you want to invest? How much more do we want to accelerate, or do we want to slow down? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So knowing there's many opportunities, again, one has to be selective, pick and choose, and being able to even take a break at times. I've had enough for a while. Let me go to work. We'll get back together. So relationships have to be very fluid, very open, and to the benefit of the person, because there's a lot of self-interest that you can't always disguise, right? I mean, there's a commission involved or a payment that's usually accepted for services, which also means it's an impact on the person. Sometimes the cost of a problem of trying to fix it is more expensive than the problem itself when you look at it. And unless someone's into personal development or into a longer term process, and if things are just for 2 weeks, it's a workshop or a training, you don't have to get into all that other stuff early, right? Because it'll just crowd the most direct and important elements away from center. Thoughts, Charles?
Yeah, I've just noticed here that Dean has left a comment. It hasn't shown up in the studio, but he left a comment on LinkedIn here, because I just refreshed your page. And he said here, my quote, "My story is about the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the next best time is today." So I think this point of that story is that sometimes we look back on our time and have regrets that we didn't do things. For example, we think, wow, wouldn't it have been great if I planted a tree on my front lawn when I first bought this house? And then 25 years later, you still live in the house, and that tree has grown with you in the house. And when you have that insight or that realization, then the next best time to plant a tree is then on that day. So when you have a realization about being in action, which is what I was talking about when you accidentally dropped off there, the importance about being in action. And if you have an insight about being in action and you have any kind of regret about not being in action years ago, the next best time to be in action towards that specific goal or against that specific insight you may have had is today. So that was one of the tree stories that Dean has reminded me about. And I think that that's a great way of paralleling healing, because people going through circumstances where they need compassion and experience compassion, when they do start to take those steps forward, they may reflect on time that they might have lost during a healing period. No matter how much support that they received from their family and friends or colleagues around them, they might look back and think, oh my gosh, look how much time I've lost because I've been wallowing in a particular situation, despite compassion that they may have been receiving from their community. But when they have that insight, instead of having regrets, then they should just take those positive steps forward that you were talking about, those single steps forward at that time when they first have those insights.
Great.
And that's the agency. That's the agency.
Great point. And by the way, I looked at my LinkedIn comments, and we've got one from OG Cartoon, an artist and extra actor, who wishes us a hello, Don and Charles. So it looks like some of the comments aren't showing up here, but Charles was pretty aware of where they could be, and that helped me. So, again, that has a lot to do with teaming up and looking at alternatives and opportunities that aren't always right in front of you, like the comments on the screen. So anytime there's suspicion of maybe more, that's the time to investigate and also to ask questions. I don't understand, and I think it's important to phrase it as if it's not their fault, right? It's easier to say, I don't quite understand, or I'm not as experienced at this as you might be. Could you explain it for me? As opposed to, I think that's wrong, but I'd love to hear why, because you just, what you hear is what you start believing. And also, you also ask yourself, I heard what they just said, but I don't understand why they said that at this point. Or I didn't think it was that dramatic, and I didn't think it, deserved that kind of response. And that's a relationship that, again, is, moving back and forth. And the people who are, again, more experienced would rather just get it out there, because if not, they're going to be under an illusion that may not be true. And you'll be harboring feelings and beliefs that may not be responsible from that person. You just picked up something, made an assumption, then decided to generalize it. And all of a sudden, the person is in a position they never anticipated doing. Or maybe a lot of what they said wasn't that serious. It was said just off the cuff, or just as a, kind of even a flippant response. And right there is when you have to make that judgment. A lot of times you can't jump into every situation that doesn't agree with you. And a lot of times I think encouraging people to know there's more than one way to look at something, right? Two people can be right about the same thing, maybe in different ways, maybe in different time frames. In time, yeah, we could do that, but it won't happen. I don't believe it could happen overnight. You never want to discount opportunities, because you don't want to rain on anybody's parade and say that's a great thought, but it's never going to happen, or you're just not up to that maybe at this point. Because if you don't believe in you and you can't share a belief in them that's honest, sincere, and something to build on, you're left with building on sand instead of rock. And I think that there's more complexity that can be positive if you approach it that way. And really, how do you get as much as you can for as fast as you can, for as little investment as you can, to come out a bigger winner, right? Just covering somebody's expenses and time is just using someone's time and expenses, right? Breaking even is too much to invest to hope to get equal, so why not help yourself, help that person, let them help you get in that plane where you're really at full speed, high performance, and you're excited. And the key is, how creative can you allow people to become? How imaginative? Let's forget about practicality at a certain point. What if, if you could dream anything, what would it be? If you can picture yourself somewhere and sincerely feel it, that's where we can take this. If it's just taking 10 and turning it into 15, that's a quantitative improvement. But how much better are you as a person? How much does it ripple to all of the other aspects of your life? And I think that's important, because people are connected to ideas, to other people, to opportunities and perspectives. Being able to see through their eyeglasses is very important. Thoughts, Charles?
Absolutely. And that's what compassion is all about, being able to see the world through their eyes and being able to walk alongside them. And I think what the comments you've made about suspending judgment, being careful, if you don't, obviously, as you say, if you don't understand why a person is in a particular situation, you might ask questions about their circumstances. If you don't understand why they have a particular view, you ask questions about why they would be coming from that particular place. But you want to hold back on any judgments or interpretations about their situation. Because the moment you do that, you then are holding back on the compassion. If you're casting moral judgment on someone that's going through a marriage breakup, that's not necessarily going to help them. And most theologies that are out there would tell you to love, would command you to love people, not to judge people. Leave the judging to the higher powers, and do the loving here on earth, regardless of what theology that you're following. And that's really what true compassion and empathy is all about. And anything other than that, there's a risk that we relate to people as being broken or needing help, and they lose their agency to be able to help themselves. So there's lots of ways we can support people and scaffold people, but we want to do it in a way that they retain their agency. And that also means they're retaining their dignity and retaining their respect.
Absolutely. And a key word I just gathered from what you just said is relatability. And I think that's so important. You know what I mean? As part of compassion is, it's easier to say, and it's always been kind of productive, is, I know how you feel. I felt the same way until I found this out, right? Because now you're sitting alongside of them and sharing that you know exactly how I feel because you were there yourself. But here's what I learned, and that there's hope. Compassion without hope is a little bit of an empty promise, but if we can relate to each other, if we can share, really be an open kimono about a lot of things, and being able to put it in a context that, you're helping not only the cause of whatever that person's focused on, but their own situation. And I think someone feeling happier than they have in the past, feeling more positively challenged, and having purpose. And I think in this ever-changing, fast-moving world, purpose is really a hard thing to identify, because there's mixed messages. I work for a great company, but I work from a crummy company, but either way, you can fill in the blanks. And, what is your life happening to, and how is it happening? Are you going to be a better spouse? Are you going to be a better parent, a better child, whatever the relationship because of it? And the other thing is, there's a whole group of fans out there with that person, and they're rooting for that person. And if they can be successful, well, that's kudos from a lot of people who they depend on. How important it is for some child to say, I'm so proud of you, Dad, for who you are, and what you've done. And that over extends beyond the simple, well, I work, I get paid, I pay my bills. It's not survival, it's prosperity. And when you have that, everything starts to go smoother, because not only are you teaching people what to do, You're teaching people how to project what you do. It's never your words, it's always your music. How enthusiastic can you be in a genuine way? How positive can you be? If you're happy, you're more inviting, right? If you walk in a room and you've got a big smile and you're shaking hands and pat people on the back and so excited to see them again, it sets the stage, as opposed to, I'm here to help you. What can we do today? That's probably the basics, and I think that's why, not to get off topic, but that's why a lot of doctor-patient relationships don't work, right? Limited time. I really don't have to know what you think. You just have to know what you need to do. There was that joke I tell once in a while. A gentleman or lady goes into a doctor's office and says, I have a headache. The doctor gives that person an aspirin, and the person says, how's it work? And the doctor says, just swallow it, right? So there's no need to know the ingredients or whatever. What's the point? Now, to somebody, there are people who are really, that's an important area. I got to know all the details and I got to weigh these things. And other people just, you're the doctor, you know better, or you know more than I do about this. And I think the offset or the complement is being able to use Chat GPT and AI to not only depend on one person, but they have context. I know now if I go to a doctor, Chat will list a whole bunch of questions that I should be asking and actually use the doctor to confirm or whatever. Same thing when you're dealing with a client. There's certain things that, how important is this to you? And there's a price for everything, a price of time, a price to some point of distraction. And if you're compassionate, you do things no one would ever find out, but you would know and you wouldn't do it. There's a lot of people, honestly, who string people along. They have limited ability and they can keep fixing the same thing over and over again and keep somebody moving, as opposed to having the confidence, hey, once you cross that bridge, there'll even be a bigger bridge we could start crossing. So the idea is get off of, point A or square one, and let's start moving forward. And let's have a 4-week or an 8-week game plan. Because again, nobody likes the surprises to say, oh, I thought this, or you mentioned this and I believed that was the thing and now we're here. Because now you got to undo certain things to redo them, or maybe you actually lost the battle already. And it's a learning experience for everybody, but I'm always more inclined to invest more up front and have something I feel good about going forward than just throw a feather to the wind and hope somehow it lands properly. And there's a sense, and if you are looking at your future, it's based on how well you helped other people's future, because that's where referrals will come from. That's where expansion of business opportunities will come from. And you just never know yourself what you don't know. And there's a point where the student becomes the teacher also, where it's not just one way. You're starting to say, boy, I'm learning something. I'm growing here. I'm being better for this. And that should be a factor as to who you get involved with and how you get involved with them. I'd rather do nothing than walk down the wrong road and put somebody in a worse position. Because a lot of times when people need help, they're in a bad situation. A lot of times people don't go for help until sometimes they're even beyond help. So the last thing I do is take more resources, take more time, and make somebody in a worse position after they left you. So how does this feel to you with your lifelong experience of working with and through people?
Well, a couple of comments as we come up on the hour that I think we haven't touched on yet about compassion. And that is that compassion is actually a skill. It's not just a virtue. But a lot of people treat compassion as something that we have or we don't have, when in actuality, compassion is a muscle. And you can train it through practices. You can, well, first of all, practices of being with people when they're in a time of need and applying some of the ideas that we've talked about in this situation, not casting judgment on them, really trying to make an effort to understand where they're coming from, what it is that has got them in a time of need or in difficult circumstances, up against a challenge. How are they feeling about it? Not getting emotionally attached, but taking a stand for them. But there are other ways that you can be a compassionate person by creating emotional self-regulation. Because quite often when people need compassion, when they go to a friend, this doesn't happen often, but the risk is, when it does happen, this is the risk, is that someone goes to a friend looking for a compassionate ear, and that person has an emotional reaction or a knee-jerk reaction. So if that friend actually practices some emotional self-regulation through mindfulness and a being still type of lifestyle, then they're going to be more compassionate. They're going to build that compassionate muscle over time. And also cognitive reframing, labeling, what's their unmet need behind the behavior. So looking at what's going on with this individual, that behind it they have because of the circumstances, they have some other unfulfilled expectation, for example, that needs to be fulfilled, and reframing that. So it's possible over time to build that muscle of compassion. And you see that actually when people go through various trainings, such as mental health first aid, which would be for lay people in the workplace or in the communities, to just understand how to be with people when they're in a time of need, whether that's a urgent mental health need or an ongoing, more subtle, quiet mental health need. Over time, people who've done that training will develop compassionate skills and a compassionate muscle. And at the same time, you'll see it in counseling. So if you have friends that go into counseling because they have that aspiration and that career commitment, as they go through that 2-year training and their practicums, you can see how they are building a compassionate muscle as a counselor. And the counselors for sure will not be emotionally attached, but they'll be committed to their clients, which is where the progress comes from. They're committed. They see also the potential in people the way a coach would. It's a different type of potential, but you can see them developing that compassionate muscle. The other thing that's interesting about compassion that people may not think about is that compassion can also be silence. And this is something that you see a lot in Asia, because the Asian cultures are typically more comfortable with silence than Western cultures in Canada, the United States, where I'm from, and you're in the US, obviously. We assume that compassion requires actions, but sometimes the action is actually being silent and actually being with somebody. If someone is going through, for example, a bereavement, they don't necessarily want to talk, but knowing that someone is there in the living room with them, just there so they're not alone, can make a really, really big difference. That action of being still, but being present at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's so valuable, and understanding that everybody has their own time, everybody has their own place. I think that's one of the feathers in one's hat that they can be proud of, is the time, the experience, and the wisdom that people have gained over time through their interpersonal relationships. And I think that puts us on a higher plane, if that's what someone is interested in, is being able to understand things faster, address them easier, and do it in a way that's a positive. It's not just healing weaknesses or putting things in a different order. It's really coming through it with some reflection, revelation, and new way of doing things. You want those aha moments to start showing up in your counseling or coaching sessions. You want people to say, I just figured it out. That was the piece I was looking for. Or I've been walking down this road so long, I forgot there were other roads. And by being able to give somebody some off ramps, and also knowing that, hey, we did enough in this area, let's not push it. It's like trying to learn how to lift weights. You'd love to lift a couple hundred pounds, but maybe you got to start with 10. And then over time, to your point, You exercise those muscles, and pretty soon 15 shows up. And you're doing it in a way that's comfortable to you versus something that's not sustainable. Anybody can do a lot fast, but can they continue it? Just like people have been on the cabbage diet. Everybody tells me it works, but how long can you eat cabbage every day, three meals a day? It's not easy. And
I wouldn't last long on that diet.
no, but that could be relatable to someone's situation who is so used to a certain way that when you bring something that's an abrupt change, it makes it unsustainable. I can do a little in the beginning and maybe build, but if you tell me to do too much too fast, I may be able to do it, but it's not comfortable. And you have to really focus on their speed, their situation. And again, that's a continuous review. Well, what do you think? Did we do too much? Did I push too far? There's some balance between being a floor mat and doing what anybody tells you to do and being overbearing and overwhelming and coming across as someone who's not a very nice person to me. And there are certain coaches that build with fear, and there's others that build with hope. And not to say it's the same for everybody, but if your personality is really compassionate, thoughtfulness, and a lot of times how you've been treated is how you treat other people. And if you have a hero that's come along, and I've had a few mentors who did things only for the good of me. I never even understood what was in it for them except helping someone, maybe getting some more benefit out of something they paid a dear price for, and now they feel there's some redemption to it. But again, it starts with an open conversation, and it's the why that's more important in the beginning than the how-to. We can do a lot of stuff, but why do we want to do it? Why do you want to do it? Why do you want to make this investment? And at that point, you got some clear sailing and knowing that it has to be positive for both parties, right? It's not that and I'll trade time for money, no matter who it is or what it is. It has to bring value to make me feel better for doing it and feel comfortable I can do it well. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you're a great football player and you decide to play lacrosse tomorrow. It's different rules, different game, different experiences. So looks like we're kind of heading up to we are past the top of the hour. Got so involved. With that, I want to thank the audience. If there's any final words you'd like to share, Charles?
Well, I just want to remind people that compassion isn't weak. It's the foundation of real strength. And Fred Rogers, I think he wrote a book called Radical Kindness. And he said there's 3 ways to ultimate success. The first way is to be kind. The second way is to be kind. And the third way is to be kind. So I invite people to bring compassion to their relationships.
Well, you've done compassion proud today, Charles, let me tell you, especially with your ending. So
it takes a team.
Yeah, well, especially even overcoming technical difficulties. We can still come out of this smiling and very positive for the experience. Want to thank the audience, the ones we've heard from and the ones we've shared with. And feel free, come back next week and we'll do it all again. Take care, be as compassionate as possible, and love to hear anything that you haven't shared today. Me and Charles look at our messages and any comments, and we'll get back to you.